His dog Ghost's strange behavior on a remote Montana mountain leads veteran Jack Callahan to a secret cave. Inside isn't an animal's den, but the dog tag of a brother-in-arms he thought had vanished years ago. But Jack has no time to process the shock. From outside, footsteps and voices echo. Two strangers carrying shovels are heading straight for the cave, with orders to erase everything, including the only witness who has just discovered their secret. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The morning sun cast long, golden fingers across the floor of the small log cabin, illuminating dust motes dancing in the crisp autumn air. Outside, the vast, silent expanse of Montana stretched in every direction, a masterpiece of towering pines and distant, jagged peaks. This was Jack Callahan's sanctuary, the quiet corner of the world he had carved out for himself after the noise of war had finally faded. At 38, Jack wore the years and the miles on his face. It was a weathered but kind face, framed by short brown hair that was beginning to show distinguished silver at the temples. He was a tall man, leaner than he had been in his army days, but with a strength that was still evident in his broad shoulders and steady hands. His uniform now consisted of a faded navy, gray and beige plaid shirt, a plain gray t-shirt underneath, worn blue jeans, and a pair of sturdy work boots that had seen better days. He sat at his small wooden table, a steaming mug of black coffee cupped in his hands, its warmth a small comfort against the morning chill. Across from him, lying patiently on the worn rug, was Ghost. The 5-year-old German shepherd was a striking animal, his thick coat a mixture of slate gray and brilliant white. His intelligent amber eyes were fixed on Jack, watching every subtle movement. Ghost was more than a dog. He was a lifeline. He was the silent confidant who had stayed by Jack's side through the long, sleepless nights when the ghosts of Afghanistan came calling. Their bond was forged not in words, but in a quiet, profound understanding that transcended language. Jack picked up the local newspaper, the Hope Valley Chronicle, its pages already feeling like a relic from another time. He scanned the headlines, his eyes skipping over the usual town gossip and local politics. A small article on the third page caught his attention for a moment. It mentioned a new town project, a plan to develop a scenic hiking trail through the Sapphire Mountains to attract more tourists. Jack grunted softly, taking a sip of his coffee. It was just town business, something that felt a world away from his quiet existence. He folded the paper and set it aside, his gaze returning to the mountains visible through his window. That was his church, his therapy. "Ready, boy?" Jack asked, his voice a low rumble. Ghost's response was immediate. His tail gave a few enthusiastic thumps against the floor, and he rose to his paws in one fluid motion, a soft whine of anticipation escaping his throat. The daily hike was their ritual. It was a time for Jack to stretch his legs and for his mind to find a semblance of peace amidst the silent majesty of nature. He grabbed his old brown leather jacket, shrugging it on over his shirt, and clipped a light pack onto his back, containing water, a first aid kit, and a powerful flashlight. Ghost waited by the door, his entire body quivering with excitement. The air outside was sharp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. The trail was familiar, a well-worn path that snaked its way up the lower slopes of the mountain. For the first hour, they walked in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the crunch of their steps on the fallen leaves and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Jack's mind began to quiet, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety receding with each step. But then, something changed. Ghost, who was trotting a few feet ahead, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His head went up, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Jack stopped too, his hand instinctively going to the handle of the large knife he always carried on his belt. He scanned the surrounding woods, his senses on high alert. He saw nothing, heard nothing out of the ordinary. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered. Ghost didn't respond to the question. He ignored the trail ahead and turned sharply to the right, pushing his way into the dense undergrowth. He stopped after a few feet and looked back at Jack, letting out a sharp, insistent bark. It wasn't a bark of aggression, but one of urgency. It was a command. "Follow me." Jack hesitated for only a second. He had learned long ago to trust Ghost's instincts. The dog had saved his life more than once, not from bullets, but from the darkness that lurked within his own mind, pulling him back from the edge with a wet nose or a heavy paw on his lap. If Ghost said something was this way, then something was this way. He pushed aside the branches, following the dog into the untamed part of the forest. They moved deeper, away from the sunlight, towards a steep, rocky cliff face that was almost completely hidden by a thick curtain of wild vines and overgrown bushes. It was a place no one would ever find by accident. Ghost didn't slow down. He scrambled up the last few feet of the incline and began to dig frantically at the base of the cliff, tearing at a particularly dense thicket of bushes with his paws. Dirt and leaves flew through the air. He whined with effort, his powerful body working with a singular, desperate focus. "Easy, boy. What have you found?" Jack said, making his way up to the dog's side. As he got closer, he saw it. Behind the tangle of roots and vines that Ghost was clearing away, there was a shadow. It was a sliver of perfect, unnatural darkness against the gray rock. An opening. Ghost had uncovered the entrance to a cave. It was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. A cold draft, carrying a musty, subterranean smell, drifted out from the darkness. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. His curiosity and his unwavering faith in his partner made the decision for him. He had to know what was inside. He unslung his pack and took out his flashlight. Jack clicked the button on the flashlight, and a powerful beam of white light sliced through the oppressive darkness. He took a steadying breath, the musty air filling his lungs, and squeezed through the narrow opening. Ghost followed immediately, staying so close that Jack could feel the dog's fur brush against his leg. The air inside was instantly colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth and stone that had not seen sunlight in a very long time. The cave was small at first, a tight passage that forced Jack to stoop. The beam of his flashlight danced over the wet, glistening rock walls. The only sound was the soft padding of Ghost's paws on the cave floor and the faint, rhythmic drip of water from somewhere deeper within. After a few yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber, maybe 15 feet across. It was eerily silent. Jack swept the light across the chamber, examining every surface. It seemed empty, just another forgotten hollow in the heart of the mountain. For a moment, he thought Ghost might have been mistaken, that this was just a fox den or a bear's winter lair. But Ghost knew better. The dog moved with a quiet purpose, his nose low to the ground, sniffing intently. He bypassed the center of the chamber and went directly to a far corner, a spot cluttered with a pile of loose rocks and soil that looked like it might have been part of a small rock slide years ago. He began to whine softly, a low, anxious sound, and then he started to dig, not frantically like he had outside, but with a determined, focused intensity. He pawed at the loose dirt, nudging rocks aside with his powerful snout. "What is it, boy?" Jack said, his voice hushed, as if not to disturb the heavy silence. He walked over and knelt beside his friend, resting a hand on Ghost's back. "What did you find?" Ghost looked up at him, his amber eyes wide and insistent, before returning to his task. Jack aimed the flashlight beam at the spot where the dog was digging. It just looked like dirt and rocks. But he trusted Ghost. He put the flashlight down, angling it so it illuminated the area, and began to help, using his gloved hands to pull away the larger stones. They were cold and damp. Underneath them, the soil was loosely packed. As Jack cleared away the debris, his fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. It was small and flat. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He carefully worked the object free from the dirt. It was thin, rectangular, and covered in grime. He wiped it clean on the leg of his jeans. The beam of the flashlight caught the glint of stamped letters on the metal surface. He held it closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was a military dog tag, A wave of ice-cold dread washed over him as he read the name etched into the metal. Beckett. David. The name hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. David Beckett, his friend, his brother in arms, the man who had laughed in the face of death in the dusty plains of Afghanistan, the man who had vanished without a trace 2 years ago. Everyone assumed he had just moved on, another soldier unable to settle back into civilian life. But this tag, here, in this hidden grave, told a different, far more sinister story. A flood of memories washed over Jack, David's easy grin, the sound of his voice telling a bad joke in the barracks, the look of fierce loyalty in his eyes. He wasn't missing. He was gone. A raw, burning anger began to smolder in Jack's chest, pushing back the grief. This was no accident. David wouldn't have come to a place like this and simply died. Someone had brought him here. Someone had buried him. Jack's training kicked in, his mind shifting from grieving friend to determined soldier. This was a crime scene. He stood up, his movement stiff. "Stay," he commanded Ghost, his voice tight. He picked up the flashlight and began a more thorough search of the immediate area. The killer had been careless, rushed. If they left the dog tag, they might have left something else. He ran the light along the base of the rock wall near the shallow grave. His eyes caught a small break in the rock, a narrow crevice just a few inches wide. Something dark had been wedged deep inside. With practiced fingers, Jack reached into the crevice and pulled it out. It was a small, black waterproof pouch, the kind soldiers use to keep personal items dry. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the seal. Inside, protected from the damp, was a small, well-worn notebook. He opened it. The pages were filled with David's familiar, messy handwriting. At first, the notes seemed random, disjointed, but as Jack flipped through the pages, a dark pattern began to emerge. There were names of local families, property deeds, and records of land sales, all connected to a single name that appeared again and again: Marcus Blackwood. Jack stood frozen in the cold, silent darkness of the cave, the flashlight beam illuminating the damning words on the page. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. David hadn't just stumbled upon this cave. He had been investigating something. He had gotten too close to a dark secret, a secret connected to Marcus Blackwood and the land he was acquiring, and for that, he had been silenced. The killer had tried to erase David from existence, but they had failed. They had left behind the one thing that could cry out for justice: the truth. A cold resolve settled over Jack as he stood in the silent darkness. The truth was a heavy weight in his hands. He carefully placed David's notebook and the dog tag into the waterproof pouch and secured it deep inside his pack. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this cold, forgotten tomb. He gave Ghost a soft pat on the head. "Let's go, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Time to leave." It not. He clicked off the flashlight, plunging the cave back into absolute blackness. He didn't need the light to find his way back through the short passage. He moved with a newfound urgency, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The sliver of daylight marking the entrance was a beacon of hope. But as they reached the opening, just as Jack was about to push aside the curtain of vines, Ghost stopped dead. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the dog's chest. He planted his paws firmly, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Then, he did something he had never done before. He forcefully shoved his head and shoulders against Jack's knees, physically pushing him back from the entrance and deeper into the shadows of the cave's mouth. The message was unmistakable. Danger. Close. Jack froze, his own senses instantly on high alert. He trusted Ghost's instincts as much as his own. He dropped into a low crouch, pulling the dog in tight against his side, his hand resting on Ghost's neck to calm him. He peered through a tiny gap in the thick veil of leaves. His blood ran cold. 2 men were making their way up the incline towards the cave. They were not hikers. The first was a large, heavily built man with a thick neck and a brutish face, his movements slow and deliberate. The second was leaner and taller, with a sallow, cruel-looking face and shifty eyes that scanned the area constantly. They were dressed in dark work clothes and carried shovels over their shoulders. One of them also held 2 large, empty canvas bags. They moved with a grim purpose that sent a chill down Jack's spine. They stopped just a few yards from the entrance. The larger man spat on the ground. "You sure this is the right spot?" he grumbled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The taller, leaner man shot him an irritated glare. "Of course it, Island. Just get it done. Blackwood wants this place clean before the town survey crew gets up here for that new trail." He said, "Leave nothing behind." The names hit Jack like a 1-2 punch. Blackwood, the new trail. The half-forgotten newspaper article from that morning flashed in his mind, connecting the dots with terrifying speed. These were Blackwood's men. They weren't here by chance. They had come to sanitize a crime scene that was years old, spurred into action by the town's plan to build a simple hiking path. It was a horrifying convergence of events, and he and Ghost had just walked right into the middle of it. Jack's mind raced. He was trapped. If they found him, they would not hesitate to silence him, just as they had silenced David. He pressed himself and Ghost further back against the cold, damp rock, praying the shadows would be enough to conceal them. The 2 men started their work, talking in low tones. They began clearing a wider area around the entrance, tossing rocks and pulling up roots. Their backs were to the cave. It was a small window, a desperate chance. Jack knew they couldn't stay. Sooner or later, one of them would glance inside. He looked down at Ghost. The dog was perfectly still, his intelligent eyes fixed on Jack, waiting for a command. Jack gave a series of slow, deliberate hand signals, the silent language they had perfected over years. "Stay low. Move silent. Follow me." Ghost blinked once in understanding. Moving with a stealth he hadn't used since his last tour in Afghanistan, Jack began to retreat. He didn't dare go back the way he came. Instead, he slid along the rock wall to the side of the entrance, seeking a different path down the steep incline. Every movement was agonizingly slow. A dislodged pebble, a snapped twig, could mean death. Ghost moved behind him like a gray shadow, his paws making no sound on the soft earth. They found a narrow game trail, partially obscured by ferns, a few yards away from the cave. It offered a steep but concealed route down the mountainside. As they slipped into the cover of the dense forest, Jack risked one last look back. The 2 men were still working, oblivious. They didn't stop until they were miles away, deep in a part of the forest Jack knew well. He finally leaned against the trunk of a massive pine, his lungs burning, his body trembling with adrenaline. Ghost sat at his feet, panting softly, his warm presence a comfort in the cold, silent woods. Jack pulled out the notebook. He stared at David's handwriting, at the name Blackwood. He thought about the 2 thugs on the mountain. He then thought about the notes David had made, the vague but unsettling references to payoffs and looking the other way that implicated members of the local town government. The horrifying truth settled upon him. He couldn't go to the Hope Valley police. He couldn't trust anyone. He and Ghost were completely, terrifyingly on their own. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the cold, hard weight of reality. Jack slid down the rough bark of the pine tree, slumping to the ground. Ghost immediately moved closer, resting his heavy head on Jack's lap, his warm, steady presence a small anchor in the swirling chaos of Jack's thoughts. On their own, the words echoed in his mind. He was one man, with one dog, against a powerful figure who had the local government in his pocket and murderers on his payroll. It was an impossible fight. He closed his eyes, his mind racing through mission scenarios, tactical options, but everything led to a dead end. He couldn't go to the authorities. He couldn't trust anyone in Hope Valley. He was an outsider, a ghost himself, and Blackwood held all the cards. Despair began to creep in, cold and suffocating, and then a memory surfaced. It was from years ago, during a quiet moment in a dusty, sun-baked outpost in a forgotten corner of Afghanistan. He and David were cleaning their rifles, the silence broken only by the rhythmic scrape of metal on metal. David had been talking about his family, a rare occurrence. "My little sister, Sarah," David had said, a proud smile on his face. "She's the smart one, always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. She's a reporter for our little hometown paper. Gives the old boys at the town council a headache every other week. She's a fighter, that one. Sarah Beckett." The name cut through the fog of Jack's despair like a searchlight. A reporter, a fighter, David's sister. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. It was a chance. "Come on, boy," Jack said, pushing himself to his feet. "We have one more stop to make." Getting back to his truck without being seen was a nerve-wracking exercise in patience and stealth. He and Ghost stuck to the dense woods, circling wide around the main trail, every snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. It was late afternoon by the time they reached the vehicle. Jack made Ghost lie down on the floor of the passenger side, out of sight, before starting the engine and heading into town. The Hope Valley Chronicle was housed in a small, unassuming brick building on Main Street, tucked between a hardware store and a diner. Jack parked a block away, watching the entrance for a few minutes. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Every person who walked by seemed to be watching him. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the truck and walked towards the building. The inside of the office was a cluttered but cozy space that smelled of old paper, ink, and coffee. Desks were piled high with stacks of newspapers and files. Jack approached a young woman at the front desk. "I'm here to see Sarah Beckett," he said, keeping his voice low and even. The receptionist gave him a curious look and pointed towards a small office in the back. "She's in there. Just knock." Jack's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the door. He knocked twice. A voice from inside called out, "It's open." He pushed the door open and stepped inside. A woman was sitting at a desk, her back to him, staring intently at a computer screen. She had shoulder-length, dark brown hair, and a slender but strong frame. "Excuse me," Jack said. "Are you Sarah Beckett?" She swiveled around in her chair, and Jack found himself looking into a pair of intelligent, sharp green eyes. They were David's eyes. Sarah Beckett was in her early 30s, with a face that was both pretty and fiercely determined. There were faint lines of worry around her eyes, a tension in her jaw that spoke of long hours and stress. "I am," she said, her tone professional but wary. "Can I help you?" Jack closed the door behind him. He didn't know where to begin, how to say what he needed to say. He decided directness was the only way. "My name is Jack Callahan," he began. "I served with your brother, David." Sarah's expression changed instantly. The professional mask fell away, replaced by a complex mix of hope and guarded suspicion. She stood up slowly. "You knew David?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He was my friend," Jack said softly. "He was my brother." He reached into his pack and slowly pulled out the waterproof pouch. His hands were steady, but his insides were churning. He took out the single dirt-stained dog tag and held it out to her in the palm of his hand. Sarah stared at it, her face paling. She reached out with a trembling hand and gently took the tag. She traced the letters of her brother's name with her fingertip, and then her composure finally broke. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and tears streamed down her face. All the pain, the uncertainty, the years of not knowing, came pouring out. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "On the mountain," Jack said, "in a hidden cave. Sarah, he didn't just leave." She looked up at him, her green eyes blazing with a fire that surprised him. "I know," she said, her voice suddenly fierce. "I never believed it. Not for a second. It would not have—" She quickly wiped the tears from her face, her grief transforming into a steely resolve. "For 2 years, I've been asking questions, digging into things people in this town want left buried. It all leads back to one man, Marcus Blackwood." It was Jack's turn to be surprised. You've been investigating him? Secretly, she confirmed. He's a cancer on this town. He buys up family land for pennies on the dollar, threatening anyone who gets in his way. I think David found out something big, and Blackwood had him silenced. In that moment, their separate paths converged into one. Jack saw the same fire in her that he remembered in her brother. He finally had an ally. He did find something, Jack said, pulling the notebook from his pack and placing it on her desk. He wrote it all down. Sarah opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the pages filled with her brother's handwriting. She looked back at Jack, her expression a mixture of sorrow and grim determination. He left us a map, she said, a map to the truth. They looked at each other, two strangers bound by a shared loss and a common enemy. The fight was no longer impossible. It was just beginning. The small, cluttered office was silent for a long moment, the air thick with shared grief and a newfound, dangerous purpose. Sarah gently closed the cover of her brother's notebook, holding it as if it were a sacred text. The initial shock had passed, leaving behind a cold, sharp-edged determination. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice low but steady. "This office isn't secure. My home is closer. We can go over this there, figure out our next move." Jack nodded in agreement. "I have my dog in the truck. I'll need to bring him." "Of course," Sarah said without hesitation. "Lead the way." As they walked back to Jack's truck, the familiar streets of Hope Valley suddenly felt hostile. Every passing car, every glance from a stranger, seemed to hold a potential threat. Jack settled Ghost in the back of Sarah's car, a small SUV that was much cleaner than his old truck. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, sitting quietly and watching the town go by through the window. Sarah's house was a modest, well-kept home on a quiet street at the edge of town, surrounded by a small garden. Inside, it was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold danger they now faced. As Sarah made coffee, Jack let Ghost explore the new space. The dog sniffed every corner before settling on a rug by the fireplace, his amber eyes following Jack's every move. They sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open between them. Sarah turned the pages slowly, her fingertips tracing her brother's handwriting. Jack watched her, giving her the space she needed to process the flood of memories and pain. Her eyes scanned the familiar script, the lists of names, the confusing notes about land deals. Then, she stopped, her finger resting on the last page. Her breath hitched. On the page, scrawled in what looked like a hurried hand, was a short, cryptic sentence. "What is it?" Jack asked, leaning forward. Sarah read the words aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "The treasure is where Dad showed us the constellations." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. A sad, nostalgic smile touched her lips. "I know what that means," she whispered. "I know where it island." She looked at Jack, her eyes shining with a mixture of sorrow and excitement. "When we were kids, our dad used to take us out into the backyard of our old house. There was this huge, ancient oak tree. He'd lay a blanket down for us under it, and he would point out all the constellations. Orion, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. He called the tree our own private observatory. It was his favorite spot in the whole world. The old Beckett family home had been sold years ago, after their parents passed away. It now stood empty on the far side of the county, neglected and waiting for a new owner. David hid something there, Jack stated, the pieces falling into place. Something he didn't want Blackwood to find. Something he knew only I could find, Sarah finished, her voice filled with pride for her brother's foresight. There was no more time to waste. They packed up the notebook, and with Ghost once again in the back seat, they drove towards the past. The house was just as Sarah had described it, a forgotten relic of a happier time. The paint was peeling, and weeds choked the overgrown yard, but the structure was still strong. And in the backyard, standing like a silent giant sentinel, was the oak tree. It was magnificent, its thick branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled arms. As soon as Jack opened the car door, Ghost shot out. He didn't run around the yard or chase a squirrel. He ran with a purpose, his nose to the ground, his powerful body moving in a direct line towards the ancient oak. He circled the massive trunk once, then stopped at a spot where the gnarled roots formed a hollow in the earth. He began to whine, a low, insistent sound, and pawed at the ground, looking back at Jack and Sarah as if to say, "It's here! Dig here!" "He knew," Sarah whispered in awe. Jack didn't need any more convincing. He retrieved a small, foldable shovel from his truck, the same one he kept for emergencies. He handed it to Sarah, and then knelt, using his hands and a tire iron to pry at the hard, compacted earth around the roots. They took turns, digging in the cool, damp soil. It was hard work, but their shared purpose fueled them. After nearly half an hour, Jack's tire iron struck something hard with a dull, metallic thud. Their eyes met. Adrenaline surged through them. Working together, they cleared the remaining dirt and lifted a heavy, mud-caked metal box from the ground. It was an old military ammunition can, rusted but still solid. They carried it to the tailgate of Jack's truck and pried open the latches. The hinges creaked in protest, but finally gave way. They lifted the lid. Inside, sealed in multiple layers of plastic, was their treasure. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was something far more valuable. It was the truth. There was a small external hard drive. There were detailed maps of the county, with specific parcels of land circled in red ink. And there were stacks of financial documents, bank statements, and transaction records that laid out a clear trail of bribery and laundered money. Jack picked up the hard drive. "This is it," he said, his voice a low growl of triumph. "This is the weapon David left for us." Sarah looked from the box to Jack, a fierce light in her eyes. The grief was still there, a permanent ache in her heart, but now it was forged with a powerful new alloy: justice. They had the evidence. They had the truth. Now, they had a war to win. The drive back to Sarah's house was a silent, tense affair. The rusty ammunition can sat on the floor of the back seat like an unexploded bomb, a heavy presence that filled the small car. They were no longer just two people mourning a lost loved one. They were custodians of a dangerous truth, a truth that had already cost David his life. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel of his truck, his gaze constantly checking the rearview mirror. Sarah sat beside him, staring out the window, but her mind was clearly miles away, processing the reality of what they had found. Unseen by them, a Hope Valley Sheriff's Department patrol car was making its slow, routine circuit through the quiet residential streets. Behind the wheel was Deputy Rourke, a man whose loyalty to his badge had been sold years ago for a steady, untraceable cash income from Marcus Blackwood. Rourke was a stocky man in his late 40s, with a perpetually sour expression and a paunch that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt. His job was simple: to be the eyes and ears of his benefactor. As he turned onto Sarah's street, his eyes were immediately drawn to the unfamiliar vehicle parked in her driveway. It was an old beat-up pickup truck, the kind that belonged to a rancher or a drifter, not a journalist. He slowed his patrol car, his gaze narrowing. He recognized Sarah's SUV parked behind it. A man he didn't recognize was getting out of the driver's side of the truck, a stranger. Rourke's hand went to his radio, but he paused, instead pulling out his personal cell phone. He scrolled to a single contact saved simply as M and pressed the call button. "It's me," Rourke said, his voice low. "That Beckett girl. She has a visitor. A man I've never seen before, driving an old Ford truck. Thought you'd want to know." He listened for a moment, then grunted in acknowledgement. "Will do." He ended the call and drove on, his face impassive. The hook had been baited. Back inside Sarah's warm, quiet home, the illusion of safety was quickly evaporating. Jack placed the ammunition can on the kitchen table with a heavy thud. Ghost, sensing the tension, lay down by the back door, his head on his paws, but his ears were erect and alert, attuned to any unusual sound. "First things first," Jack said, pulling the hard drive from its plastic wrapping. Let's see what David wanted us to find. Sarah retrieved her laptop, and Jack connected the drive. A folder appeared on the screen, simply labeled Evidence. Inside, there were dozens of files, scanned documents, spreadsheets, photographs of clandestine meetings taken from a distance, and a subfolder labeled Audio. Jack's breath caught. He clicked on the first audio file. A voice filled the room, a voice that was smooth, cultured, and utterly chilling. It was Marcus Blackwood. The recording was a phone conversation, clear as day. "The old Henderson farm is the last piece," Blackwood's voice said. "He's refusing to sell. Make him an offer he can't refuse. I don't care how you do it, just get it done. I want that land." They listened, spellbound, as one recording after another laid bare Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise. There were conversations with bribed officials, threats against landowners, and detailed plans for his land grab scheme. The final recording made them both freeze. It was a conversation between Blackwood and a man they didn't recognize. "He knows too much," Blackwood said, his voice cold as ice. "The soldier boy, Beckett. He's been snooping around, asking questions. He's a liability we can't afford. Take care of it, permanently." The recording ended. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah buried her face in her hands, a sob racking her body. Jack put a hand on her shoulder, his own heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. They had found it. A confession. A motive. They had found David's killer. As this grim realization settled over them, Ghost suddenly shot to his feet. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest, the fur on his back standing on end. He stared intently at the front of the house. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, his hand immediately reaching for the heavy iron skillet on the stove. Then they heard it. The crunch of gravel in the driveway, followed by the soft thud of car doors closing. Too soft, too stealthy. Before Jack could even move towards the window, the front door splintered inwards, kicked off its hinges with a single, violent blow. The two thugs from the mountain filled the doorway, their brutish faces set in grim masks. They were the same men Jack had seen before, Blackwood's enforcers. "Blackwood sends his regards," the bigger one snarled. Events exploded in a blur of motion. As the men lunged forward, Ghost launched himself through the air. He was a gray and white blur of righteous fury, his powerful jaws clamping down on the arm of the first man. The man screamed in pain and surprise, staggering back, his attention completely diverted by the 70-pound animal attached to his arm. "Go! Now!" Jack yelled, shoving Sarah towards the back of the house. He swung the heavy skillet, connecting with the second man's shoulder with a sickening crunch. The thug roared in anger, but the blow bought them a precious second. Jack didn't wait to see more. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her through the kitchen. He kicked open the back door, and they stumbled out into the cool night air, the sounds of the struggle, of breaking furniture, and Ghost's furious snarling echoing behind them. They ran, plunging into the dark woods behind the house, their hearts pounding with terror, the hunt having officially begun. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches clawed at their faces and clothes, and unseen roots threatened to trip them with every frantic step. They ran blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline, the sounds of the chaotic struggle in the house fading behind them, replaced by the thundering of their own hearts and the ragged gasps for air. Jack kept a firm grip on Sarah's arm, pulling her along, his eyes scanning the darkness for any path, any cover. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away. A distant shout cut through the night, followed by the furious barking of a dog that was not Ghost. A wave of cold dread washed over Jack. They had brought a dog, a hunting dog. "This way," he hissed, changing direction, pulling Sarah deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. They pushed on for what felt like an eternity, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming in protest. Finally, when Jack was sure they had put some distance between themselves and their pursuers, he found a small, dense thicket of pines and pulled Sarah down into the shadows. They collapsed onto the damp, needle-strewn ground, chests heaving. Silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. They were alone, and they had nothing. Sarah was in a thin sweater, completely inadequate for the dropping temperature. Jack had his jacket, but they had no food, no water, no shelter. All they had was the hard drive, which Jack had shoved into his pocket in the chaos, and the clothes on their backs. "Ghost," Jack whispered into the darkness. There was a faint rustle, and then a wet nose nudged his hand. The dog had followed them, a silent gray shadow moving through the woods. A wave of immense relief washed over Jack. He wasn't sure what had happened back at the house, but his partner was safe, for now. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice low and steady, forcing a calm he didn't feel. His military training took over, pushing aside the fear and leaving only the cold, hard calculus of survival. "They'll be searching for us at first light. We need to find cover, and we need to be smart." Sarah shivered, hugging her arms to her chest. "What do we do, Jack?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We survive," he said simply. For the next few hours, Jack became the soldier he once was. He led them away from the town, moving parallel to a small, gurgling creek he found, its sound helping to mask their own. He taught Sarah how to step on rocks and dry leaves to minimize their tracks. They drank the ice-cold, clear water from the creek, the simple act feeling like a luxury. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and purple, Jack found what he was looking for: a shallow overhang at the base of a rocky outcrop, concealed by a thick curtain of ancient, gnarled tree roots. It wasn't much, but it was defensible and hidden from view from the air. "We'll rest here for the day," he said, helping Sarah into the small space. Ghost immediately took up a sentinel position at the entrance, his body low to the ground, his ears twitching, scanning the forest for any sign of danger. The day passed in a blur of tense, whispered conversations and long, unnerving silences. The cold seeped into their bones. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. The reality of their situation was a crushing weight. They were fugitives, hunted in their own backyard. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, sent a fresh jolt of fear through them. Jack did his best to keep their spirits up. He showed Sarah how to identify a few edible roots, though they were bitter and unsatisfying. He used his knife to fashion a small, sharp spear, more for a sense of security than any real hope of catching game. He was a protector, a provider, falling back on the only skills he had left. As dusk began to settle once more, wrapping the forest in its shadowy embrace, Sarah's hope began to fray. "How long can we do this, Jack?" she whispered, her voice raw. "We can't just live in the woods forever. They'll find us eventually." "I know," he admitted, his own resolve wearing thin. "We need a plan, an endgame." They sat in silence for a while, the enormity of their problem hanging between them. They had the evidence to destroy Blackwood, but it was useless if they were dead. They were trapped, isolated, with no one to turn to. Then, an idea sparked in Sarah's mind. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was better than nothing. "There might be someone," she said slowly, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "Someone we can trust." Jack looked at her, his expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. "His name is Sheriff Donovan," she explained. "He's the sheriff of the next county over, Clearwater County. He's different, old school, by the book. My dad knew him, said he was the most honest lawman he'd ever met. Blackwood's money and influence don't reach that far. Donovan can't be bought." A flicker of hope ignited in Jack's chest. It was a destination, a goal. It changed everything. They were no longer just running away, they were running towards something. "Clearwater County," Jack said, the name tasting like a prayer on his lips. He visualized a map in his head. It was a long way on foot, at least 2 days of hard travel through rough, unforgiving terrain. "It'll be dangerous. We'll have to stay off all roads, cross the ridgeline." "It's our only chance," Sarah said, her voice firm, her reporter's resolve returning. Jack looked at her, then down at Ghost, who seemed to understand the shift in mood, his tail giving a slight, hopeful thump against the ground. The odds were still stacked against them. They were hungry, exhausted, and hunted, but now they had a mission. "Okay," Jack said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Okay, Sarah, let's go see Sheriff Donovan." With a shared, determined nod, they began their journey. The decision to move, to fight back, had ignited a small flame of hope in the cold darkness of their fear. They moved only under the cloak of night, a trio of ghosts slipping through the Montana wilderness. Jack took the lead, with Sarah close behind and Ghost moving silently at his side, a constant, reassuring presence. The journey was a brutal test of endurance. Each night was a long, grueling march through dense forest and over treacherous, rocky terrain. The days were spent huddled in whatever cold, damp cover Jack could find, sharing the last of the bitter roots they had foraged, their stomachs aching with a constant, hollow hunger. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, plagued by the cold and the ever-present fear of discovery. Jack's military experience was the only thing that kept them going. He navigated by the stars, found sources of clean water, and moved with a stealth that defied their exhaustion. He was their guide, their protector, their unwavering pillar of strength. On the second night, their fragile hope was nearly shattered. They were moving through a thick section of woods that ran parallel to a deserted county road. Their plan was to cross it and get to the ridgeline on the other side. As they neared the edge of the trees, Jack held up a hand, signaling a halt. Up ahead, the road was lit by the harsh, flashing blue and red lights of a patrol car. "A checkpoint," Sarah whispered, her heart sinking. Jack's eyes narrowed. It didn't make sense. This road led to nowhere important. Why would there be a checkpoint here, in the middle of the night? He watched for a few minutes. It was a single car from the Hope Valley Sheriff's Department. A deputy leaned against the vehicle, his silhouette illuminated by the flashing lights. "Something's wrong," Jack muttered, his soldier's intuition screaming at him. "This is a trap." As if to confirm his suspicion, Ghost, who had been standing perfectly still beside him, let out a nearly inaudible growl. The sound was so low, it was more of a vibration in his chest. He took a half step in front of Jack and Sarah, his body tensing, his nose twitching as he tasted the air. He wasn't looking at the patrol car, he was looking into the dark woods on either side of the road. Jack placed a calming hand on Ghost's back, trusting the dog's instincts implicitly. He followed Ghost's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows, but then, a flicker of movement, a shadow that detached itself from another shadow, then another. They were there, waiting in the darkness, hidden from view. A reception committee, Blackwood's men, working with the corrupt police. A cold sweat broke out on Jack's brow. They had almost walked right into it. If it hadn't been for Ghost, they would be dead or captured. "Back?" Jack breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Slowly, not a sound, they retreated back into the depths of the forest, moving with painstaking care. The detour cost them precious hours and energy they couldn't afford to lose, forcing them up a steep, treacherous slope to bypass the trap. But they were alive. Ghost had saved them once again, his loyalty and instincts a shield against the darkness that hunted them. 2 more days passed in a grueling haze of exhaustion and hunger. They were running on fumes, their bodies screaming in protest. Sarah's sweater was torn, and Jack's face was gaunt, but their resolve never wavered. Finally, late in the afternoon on the 4th day, they stumbled out of the woods and saw it. In the valley below, nestled against a clear, winding river, was a small town. It wasn't Hope Valley. It had a different feel, cleaner, more open. It was the town of Clearwater. Relief so powerful it almost brought them to their knees, washed over them. They had made it. They found a public restroom at a small park and did their best to clean up, washing the grime from their faces and hands. They were a ragged, desperate sight, but they were no longer fugitives in the wild. The sheriff's office was a simple, sturdy brick building on the town's main street. A sign with crisp, clean lettering read, "Clearwater County Sheriff." Jack took a deep breath, looked at Sarah, and then down at Ghost. This was it. He pushed open the door. The man behind the front desk was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s. He had a full head of graying hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a calm, steady gaze that seemed to miss nothing. His uniform was immaculate, and he wore his badge with an air of quiet authority. This had to be him. "Can I help you?" the sheriff asked, his voice a calm, deep baritone. "Are you Sheriff Donovan?" Jack asked. "I am," the man confirmed, his eyes taking in their disheveled appearance without judgment. "My name is Jack Callahan. This is Sarah Beckett," Jack said, his voice hoarse from days of disuse. "We need your help. We have a story to tell you, and we have proof." Sheriff Donovan looked from Jack's weary but determined face to Sarah's, then to the loyal dog standing faithfully at their side. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the truth in their eyes. He stood up and gestured towards his office. "Then you'd better come in and tell it," he said. They walked into his office, and Jack placed the mud-stained hard drive on the sheriff's clean, organized desk. The journey was over. The fight for justice was about to begin. Sheriff Donovan's office was silent except for the chilling sound of Marcus Blackwood's voice emanating from the laptop speakers. Donovan sat behind his desk, his face a mask of cold fury, his fingers steepled under his chin. He listened to every word, his steady gaze fixed on the hard drive Jack had placed on his desk. Jack and Sarah sat opposite him, exhausted but resolute, while Ghost lay faithfully at their feet, a silent, watchful guardian. When the final recording ended, the one containing the explicit order to kill David Beckett, Donovan let out a long, slow breath. He clicked the file closed and leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. He looked at Jack, then at Sarah, and a look of profound respect settled in his eyes. "You've done good work," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Dangerous work. Your brother was a hero, Miss Beckett. And you, son?" he said, his gaze shifting to Jack. "You're a damn fine soldier." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful main street of Clearwater. "This is enough evidence to put Marcus Blackwood away for the rest of his life. The problem isn't the proof. The problem is the man." He turned back to face them. "Blackwood owns Hope Valley. He has judges in his pocket, half the town council on his payroll, and a leash on your sheriff's department. If I go over there and arrest him quietly, he'll be out on bail before the sun sets. This case will get buried in legal paperwork so deep we'll never see the inside of a courtroom. His lawyers will paint you as vigilantes, as criminals." A knot of despair tightened in Sarah's stomach. "So what do we do?" A grim smile touched Donovan's lips. "We don't arrest him quietly. We detonate a bomb in the middle of his carefully crafted world. We can't just bring the truth to a judge. We have to bring it to the people. We have to expose him so publicly, so completely, that no amount of money or influence can save him from the fallout." An idea began to form in his mind. "The Hope Valley Founders Day Festival is this Saturday. Blackwood is the main sponsor. He'll be on stage, giving the speech about community and progress, playing the part of the town's beloved benefactor. That's where we'll spring our trap." The plan was audacious, risky, but brilliant. The festival always had large video screens on either side of the stage for the crowd in the back. Donovan's plan was to hijack the feed during Blackwood's speech and play the most damning recording, the one ordering David's murder, for the entire town to hear. "My team can handle the technical side," Donovan said. "But we need to control the chaos. When that recording plays, his men will try to bolt, especially his lead enforcer, the one you saw at the cave. It is Epirus." Jack's mind immediately went to the larger of the two thugs, the one with the cruel eyes. "I have an idea for that," he said, looking down at Ghost. "My dog is trained, not police trained, but army trained. His loyalty is absolute. If I can get a scent, he can track it." Donovan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Sarah's eyes lit up. "The house," she said. "They broke in. They must have left something behind. Hair, sweat, anything." The next few days were a blur of intense, clandestine activity. One of Donovan's most trusted deputies, a young, tech-savvy woman named Deputy Evans, drove to Hope Valley in an unmarked car and, under the guise of a preliminary insurance investigation, managed to collect forensic samples from Sarah's ransacked home. She came back with a sealed evidence bag containing a wool glove one of the thugs had dropped during the struggle with Ghost. The scent was all Jack needed. He spent hours in a secluded field behind the sheriff's station, working with Ghost. He let the dog sniff the glove, repeating a command, "Find him, find him." He had another deputy, a man of similar build to the thug, walk off and hide. Then Jack would release Ghost. The dog, driven by instinct and his unwavering bond with Jack, performed flawlessly every time, locating the hidden deputy with unerring accuracy. On the day of the festival, the air in Hope Valley was thick with a strange mixture of forced cheerfulness and an undercurrent of tension that only Jack, Sarah, and Donovan's team could feel. The town square was packed. Families laughed, children chased each other with balloons, and the smell of popcorn and grilled hot dogs filled the air. On the main stage, Marcus Blackwood, dressed in an expensive suit, smiled and waved, the very picture of civic pride. Jack, Sarah, and Ghost were positioned near the back of the crowd, close to the sound and video tent where Deputy Evans was now in control. Several of Donovan's plainclothes deputies were scattered throughout the audience. Blackwood stepped up to the podium to thunderous applause. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his smooth voice washing over the crowd. "It is an honor to stand before you today in this wonderful town we all call home." He spoke for several minutes, weaving a web of lies about his commitment to the town's future. Then, as he paused for effect, Evans made her move. The image on the two giant screens behind Blackwood flickered. His smiling face was replaced by the static of an audio file. And then, his own voice, cold and ruthless, echoed across the town square. "He knows too much. The soldier boy. Beckett. He's a liability we can't afford. Take care of it. Permanently." A wave of shocked silence fell over the crowd, followed by confused murmurs, which quickly grew into a roar of outrage. Blackwood's face went pale, his confident smile melting into a mask of pure panic. In the crowd, Jack saw him, the big enforcer. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was already trying to push his way through the stunned and angry mob, heading for an alley. "Ghost," Jack said, his voice low and clear, pointing subtly. "Find him." Ghost didn't hesitate. He shot forward, a gray and white missile weaving through the forest of legs. The crowd parted instinctively. The enforcer heard the commotion and glanced back, his face contorting in fear as he saw the dog closing in. He broke into a full sprint. But he was no match for Ghost. Just as the thug reached the mouth of the alley, Ghost launched himself, seizing the man's leg in his powerful jaws. He didn't bite to maim, but his grip was like a steel trap. The man crashed to the ground with a cry of pain. Ghost stood over him, growling, holding him there until two of Donovan's deputies rushed in and slapped handcuffs on his wrists. On the stage, Sheriff Donovan himself stepped up to the podium, flanked by two more deputies, and placed a firm hand on a stunned Marcus Blackwood's shoulder. The perfect trap had been sprung. A collective gasp swept through the town square, followed by a wave of angry shouting. The hero they had been cheering for moments ago was a monster. The trust of an entire town shattered in a single, chilling audio clip. Blackwood, his face ashen, finally snapped out of his shock. "This is a lie! A fabrication!" he roared into the microphone, his voice cracking with desperation. "This man," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Donovan, "is trying to ruin me! It's a conspiracy!" But his words were drowned out by the rising tide of public fury. The people of Hope Valley were looking at him now, not with admiration, but with dawning horror and betrayal. They heard the cold, calculating voice that ordered a man's death. Donovan didn't flinch. "Marcus Blackwood," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise. "You are under arrest for the murder of David Beckett and for conspiracy, fraud, and extortion. He gestured to his deputies, who efficiently secured Blackwood's hands behind his back. The satisfying click of the handcuffs seemed to echo across the square, a final, definitive sound of justice. From the back of the crowd, Jack and Sarah watched, a profound sense of relief washing over them. Jack rested a hand on Ghost's head, scratching behind his ears. The dog looked up at him, his amber eyes seeming to understand that their long, dangerous journey was finally over. Sarah's eyes were filled with tears, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of vindication for her brother, for his memory. David's name was finally cleared. The deputies led a struggling, protesting Blackwood off the stage. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of anger and disgust. The spell was broken. The king had been dethroned in his own castle, his power evaporating in the harsh light of public truth. As the chaos began to subside, Jack, Sarah, and Ghost slipped away from the edge of the crowd. The fight was over. The long night of fear had ended, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they could see the promise of a new dawn for Hope Valley. The chaos that erupted in the town square did not subside quickly. It transformed from a wave of shock into a current of righteous anger that swept through Hope Valley, washing away the years of fear and quiet submission that Marcus Blackwood had cultivated. His arrest, and that of his enforcers, was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, a deep and thorough investigation, led by Sheriff Donovan, with Sarah Beckett's fearless reporting bringing every dark secret to light, dismantled Blackwood's entire corrupt network. The tendrils of his influence were severed one by one, from the town council to the local sheriff's department. The town was performing a painful but necessary surgery on itself. 3 months later, the sharp bite of late autumn had given way to the deep, quiet cold of a Montana winter. A thick blanket of pure white snow covered the landscape, muffling sound and making the world seem clean, new, and full of possibility. The air was still and cold, but the sun shone brightly in a brilliant blue sky, glinting off the snow-covered roofs of Hope Valley. The town had gathered once more in the square, but the atmosphere was a world away from the forced festivity of Founders' Day. Today, the mood was one of somber reflection, respect, and a quiet, resilient hope. A new, simple stone memorial had been erected near the town hall. On it, a bronze plaque was etched with a name, David Beckett. Sheriff Donovan, looking more like a pillar of the community than just a lawman, stood before the assembled crowd. Jack and Sarah stood in the front row, Ghost sitting calmly between them, his presence a source of steady comfort. Jack wore his old brown leather jacket, but he stood taller now, his shoulders less burdened. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet clarity. Sarah, wrapped in a warm blue coat, looked strong and poised, her grief now mingled with a fierce pride. We are gathered here today not just to mourn a loss, but to honor a hero. Donovan's voice resonated through the quiet square. David Beckett was a soldier who fought for his country, and he was a citizen who fought for his community. He saw a darkness creeping into our town, and he refused to look away. He gave his life uncovering the truth. And it is because of his courage, and the courage of those who carried on his fight, that Hope Valley can look forward to a new dawn. He spoke of the lands that had been stolen and were now being returned to their rightful owners, of the corruption that had been rooted out, and of the town's chance to heal and rebuild on a foundation of integrity. When he was finished, he and the mayor unveiled the plaque. David Beckett, beloved son, brother, and hero of Hope Valley. His name was finally cleared, his sacrifice finally honored. Later that day, as the winter sun began to dip towards the snow-capped peaks, Jack, Sarah, and Ghost walked along a quiet, snow-covered path leading back to Jack's cabin. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. They had been through the fire together and had emerged on the other side, forever changed, forever bonded. He would have been proud of you, Sarah, Jack said softly, his breath misting in the cold air. He would have been proud of both of us, she corrected, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. He always said you were the best man he ever knew. The kind of man who would always do the right thing, no matter the cost. Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his jacket. For years, he had felt like a ghost himself, a man out of time, disconnected from the world. But now, he felt grounded. The quiet life he had sought in Montana was no longer an escape from the world, but a life he was actively building. He had found a purpose beyond mere survival. He had found a home. They reached the cabin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a welcoming beacon. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and the small space was filled with a sense of peace. Ghost padded over to his favorite spot on the rug before the fire and lay down with a contented sigh. Jack made them both a mug of hot coffee, and they stood by the window, looking out at the vast, beautiful, and silent landscape. The mountains, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt like watchful protectors. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked quietly. Jack took a sip of his coffee, considering the question. The future, which had once seemed like a terrifying, formless void, now felt like an open road. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but I'm not running anymore. Maybe I'll finally start living." He looked at her, his gaze steady and clear. "What about you?" "The Hope Valley Chronicle needs a new editor-in-chief," she said, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Someone to make sure no one like Blackwood can ever cast a shadow over this town again." Jack smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. They couldn't ask for anyone better. And over Dom. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the snow in hues of pink and gold. The fight was over. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. Here, in this small cabin, with his best friend at his feet and a new, unbreakable bond by his side, Jack Callahan was finally home. He was ready for the quiet, beautiful dawn of a new life. The deepest loyalty is often a quiet presence, a silent promise that we are never truly alone on our journey. The bond between a soldier and his dog is a powerful reminder that healing often begins with a trusting paw in our hand and a faithful heart at our side. If this story of courage and companionship resonated with you, letting us know with a like helps these tales find others who need to hear them. We invite you to join our community by subscribing and sharing this story. A new adventure with another loyal hero is ready for you now, just a click away on the video appearing on your screen.